Hello and welcome back to Made Men. This is Paul Whitcomb along with Ray Franz, my co-host, and today we're talking about the Chicago outfit and its infiltration of the city of Las Vegas. And we have a very special guest. Say hello to mobologist friend Larry Henry.
Good to see you guys. Thank you for having me on.
Larry, it's great to have you, and I've certainly enjoyed your work over the years, and that's why we really were excited to have an opportunity to talk to you today about the history of the Chicago outfit and Las Vegas. Would you tell us a little bit about your background and how you're interested in this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Longtime reporter. I was a reporter in Reno in the early 80s. I'd been a night police reporter in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then went to Nevada to be a reporter for the Reno Gazette-Journal, the daily newspaper in Reno. In the early 80s, when the mob was, really still very active. Tony Spilotro was still around, and all those things were still going on. Now, it was seen differently back then, the way people view that era now versus then. But then I ended up working for the Las Vegas Sun newspaper as their political reporter. Worked for a time as press secretary for Bob Miller, who was the governor, lieutenant governor, then governor, who had a background in Chicago, Paul, and that's how I really began to get interested in it. One, through my work as a reporter in Nevada, in Reno and Las Vegas, but also working for Bob Miller. He had grown up on the north side of Chicago, and when his dad had run a burlesque, sort of a combo burlesque bookie joint. I don't remember exactly where it was in Chicago. And when Bob, who became the governor, his son, Ross Miller was the name of the person who ran the bookie joint, and illegal bookie joint, obviously. Now sports betting is legal in Illinois, but in those days it wasn't. So he ended up getting a percentage of the Riviera in Las Vegas. Ross, the dad, left Chicago, and I think Bob was about 10. He was young when they all moved to Las Vegas. These were the early days of Las Vegas when there was wide open space between casinos, and it was basically the only place you could legally gamble. Now there are 1,000 casinos across the country. Sports betting is legal and live in 38 states, about to go live in the 39th, Missouri, sometime this fall. It's legal there, it just isn't live yet. So now the atmosphere is a lot different from what it was then. But when he went to Las Vegas, his dad, ran the Riviera, which is gone now. It's since been demolished, as have many of the old mob places in Las Vegas. But became a business partner with Carl Thomas, who later was convicted of skimming at the Tropicana, which also, by the way, has been demolished. They're building a baseball stadium there for the A's. We can talk about the transformation of Las Vegas. But so, in his role running the Riviera, Ross became, he wasn't a mobster, but he was associated with people back in those days like Jimmy Hoffa, Alan Dorfman, those kind of people who were involved in Las Vegas. You dealt with those kind of people as a casino operator, and then of course as a business partner of Carl Thomas's, he had a piece of Circus Circus, which he negotiated with Jay Sarno, and also Slots of Fun. Both are still there, by the way, Circus Circus and Slots of Fun, although Circus Circus now is for sale. So that's sort of my background. And then when I worked for him when he was governor, the Sun, when I worked for him when he was governor, there was a lot of it came back. This was in the mid 80s. Newspapers around the country would call and say, hey, you're running for governor. He was lieutenant governor, and the guy who was governor was running for the Senate, which meant Bob Miller was going to be elevated to the governorship. Is this guy a mobster? His dad was affiliated with those guys. So all that kind of percolated again, and that really generated my interest as a reporter and then working for Bob Miller with his connections to Chicago and his dad's connection. It really got me. I was young, those were my young reporter days. It really got me interested in what was going on with the mob because it was so different back then in Las Vegas. Way pre-movie Casino. People in Las Vegas back then didn't see Frank Rosenthal as a glamorous, as a Robert De Niro. They didn't see Jerry Rosenthal as Sharon Stone. They didn't see Tony Spilotro as Joe Pesci. They were sort of embarrassed back in those days about those kind of hoodlums, gangsters running casinos and blowing up cars and all that stuff in Las Vegas. So, even in 1993, by the way, even into the 90s, the Flamingo, there was still a building left at the Flamingo that Ben Siegel had built in 1946 that he lived in. It got demolished in 1993 because the people who were running the Flamingo said, we don't want to be associated with a gangster. That shows how far Las Vegas has come. Now there's a mob museum, there's, movies. And so people's view now of what Las Vegas was like is really coming under a microscope. But back in those days, there was a lot of scrutiny on how Las Vegas had gotten to where it had gotten via gangsters, many of whom were from Chicago.
Sure. I'd like to talk about those days for sure. That's a big center of attention for all our listeners. But can we go back to the 40s and talk a little bit about how organized crime got a foothold in Las Vegas and what it was like at that time?
Yeah, it's and I'll go back even a little bit more, back into when gaming was legalized at the legislature, broad open gambling in 1931. There was some suspicion that even back then the Chicago outfit had been involved in bribing lawmakers they were trying to get the dog racing industry going there, as I understand it. Some suspicion that Johnny Roselli, Curly Humphreys, people like that may have been involved in bribing legislators because Capone supposedly was connected to some people in Reno who had some casinos. So even way back then, there was involvement, Paul, with Chicago. So you fast forward back then, keep in mind, Hot Springs, Arkansas, places like that. Al Capone was heavily involved in Hot Springs. It was kind of an open city like Las Vegas became. You had New York, you had Frank Costello in Hot Springs, you had Ben Siegel. So Las Vegas was kind of a sleepy little place. Reno was more hopping through the 30s and then into the 40s than Las Vegas. But then at that time, Nevada was the only place where off-track betting was allowed. So the race wire, which Chicago was heavily involved in, that pumped race results to sports bookies, was controlled by operators like Ben Siegel, Mo Sedway, people like that in Las Vegas into the 40s. And Chicago was heavily involved in LA and in Las Vegas with the race wire. All right, so that sort of gets us from the 30s into the 40s. That's when that off-track betting really began to draw a lot of attention in Las Vegas. More people were coming in. There was with the war going on, there was a lot of activity in Las Vegas. The Hoover Dam, brought a lot more people to Las Vegas. So in the mid 40s, Benjamin Siegel took over from a guy who was kind of a degenerate gambler, really influential in Los Angeles, named Billy Wilkerson. He ran the Hollywood Reporter, which, by the way, still exists, not in his family. He ran a newspaper about Hollywood. He had nightclubs in Hollywood. He was a big deal, but he was also a degenerate gambler. So Ben Siegel came in and saw what was going on, saw that there would be a lucrative opportunity in Las Vegas, which is, even to this day, Las Vegas doesn't include the major resorts on the Strip. That's actually outside of the city limits, though everybody calls it Las Vegas. So Siegel saw an opportunity on the highway to Southern California to take over from Wilkerson construction of the Flamingo in the mid 40s, and did, and got it built. Opened in 1946, December 1946. It was kind of a new. There were casinos on the Strip before. There wasn't called. It was a highway. It was Highway 91 to Los Angeles. It was the first place that was really sort of glamorous, and there were a couple of places that had sort of a Western, Old West type thing, and so he brought in this brought a lot of Hollywood folks in. Later, 6 months later, was killed. Allegations of skimming and all that in Beverly Hills. So that then really opened the door. It opened a lot of eyes, not just with the New York people that Siegel was associated with, Siegel and Ben Sedway and people like that. It also opened the door to other organized crime groups, Detroit, St. Louis, and most prominently Chicago. So that's really sort of get you up past World War II, from the 30s up to World War II. Chicago, all very, very actively involved throughout that whole process.
Let's take a moment and talk about the death of Ben Siegel. I know that you and I have talked about this on the phone earlier today. Recently, some information has come out in a new book, which we'll probably talk about in another episode, that suggests that it was Chicago that killed Ben Siegel, because not only was he in trouble with New York, but he was actually trying to extort the outfit to pay a fee for the use of their own wire. What do you think about that, Larry?
Yeah, keep in mind back then, tracks all over the place. There's some big races. There was a big race in Santa Anita in LA yesterday, big race in New York at Aqueduct, which is sort of a sidebar about it's supposedly going to close in a year or so. But there were horse tracks all over the country, still are, that were very active, and you couldn't get the results. Bookies couldn't get the results without the race wire. So the race wire, control the race wire, Siegel was intimately involved in that because it was so extraordinarily lucrative. There are allegations, a lot of theories about why he was shot, and I'd love to. I was just, by the way, I just went by out of curiosity the other day, drove by that house in Beverly Hills to see what it looked like. It's still pretty much the same, but a lot of allegations about who it may have been, how he treated Virginia Hill, his girlfriend. It may have been her brother. But anyway, control the race wire is one of the dominant theories about why he was killed. He was extorting bookies in L.A. He was extorting Chicago. He was strong arming a lot of people, and that one of the theories is that the race wire was at the center of why he was killed.
Sure, and of course Virginia Hill got her start in Chicago with Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca.
Yeah, she was, active with the, at a very young age. I think had come up from Birmingham, Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, had gone up to Chicago very young as a teenager, as I recall. Paul, you guys know more about that than I do, but apparently, yeah, got very involved in Chicago at an early age. So Chicago has been right at the heart of everything that's happened in Las Vegas from the jump. And, you look at people like Roselli. Roselli was, whether he was part of bribing the lawmakers in the 30s to legalize gambling, Roselli was extremely active in a lot of things that happened in Las Vegas, from the Tropicana to bringing Howard Hughes in and being a middleman with Howard Hughes taking over a lot of the casinos in Las Vegas, which was one of the first steps in moving the mob out. Then you had that next generation, which really brought a lot of attention to Las Vegas. The Lefty Rosenthal's and Tony Spilatro's, a lot more violent era. Back to Roselli, he had gone under Giancana's envoy in the mid to late 50s. More of a suave guy. He was a political fixer, hung out the golf course and all those sort of things. Then you get into the 70s when Alan Glick took over Argent Corp. Alan Glick, real estate developer, Vietnam veteran from San Diego, with help from Midwestern mobsters, Milwaukee Mob and so forth, took over some casinos in Las Vegas, predominantly four: the Hacienda, Marina, Stardust, and Fremont. That's when it got a lot more violent. And that's when Chicago really wedged its way in and took over a lot of what was going on in Las Vegas, and a lot of what people think of now when they think about the mob in Las Vegas. Ben Siegel, Mo Sedway, a lot of the people we've just talked about. But what a lot of people really think about when they think about the mob in Las Vegas, it's that period in the early to mid 80s, even into the 90s, by the way, with Herbie Blitzstein. That's what people really think about, in large part because of the movie Casino and all that. But that's what a lot of people think about when they think about the mob in Las Vegas. And that was definitely Chicago.
Without a doubt. And I think it's very ironic that after Bugsy Siegel was killed, who shows up to take over the casino but Gus Greenbaum, who was deeply connected, of course, with Cleveland, but with Chicago as well. And Chicago would eventually take Gus Greenbaum out.
Was it Accardo and Ricca that wanted Greenbaum in, or was it someone else?
Well, Ricca, as well as Johnny Roselli, were in prison at the time on the Hollywood extortion scandal, which we'll talk about in another episode. But Accardo, I think his biggest contribution was what he did with the Stardust, which was something really unique. What do you think about that, Larry? And the way the Stardust kind of started the transformation of Las Vegas into a family destination.
Yeah. And yeah, speaking of Gus Greenbaum, by the way, that was another person that Ross Miller, who had the burlesque illegal bookie joint in Chicago. Gosh, I wish I could remember the name of the street. I saw something the other day about it. I think it's a deli now or something. I can't remember the name of the street, but I'll text you later with it. But um, and also Gus Greenbaum, he was also affiliated back in those days when you ran a casino. Gus Greenbaum was intimately involved in all that. Later, taken out in a violent way. But yeah, when Ben Siegel was killed in June of 1947, Greenbaum and others walked in and said we're in control. So yeah, and the whole Stardust, what the Stardust did, and I'll sort of transition to the 80s too. What the Stardust did was also bring some sparkle to Las Vegas. Almost all the places along the highway to Southern California, now known as the Strip, allegedly called that by a dirty cop from Los Angeles who opened the Golden Nugget, Guy McAfee, that he was thinking of the Sunset Strip, now called the Strip, Las Vegas Boulevard. It began to really bring in a lot of entertainers, and in addition to all the mob stuff, but they were skimming like crazy and sending money back to mob associates and bosses in Chicago, Kansas, Savella crime family in Kansas City, Milwaukee. A lot of that money was being skimmed out of those casinos. It also brought a lot of pizzazz to Las Vegas with places like the Stardust. That's when the Dunes and all those other places, the shows, the elaborate, showgirl stuff with the feathers and buffets and all those things to get people to Las Vegas to come gamble. The Rat Pack at the Sands, which now is gone, the Venetian's there now, but the Rat Pack at the Sands, late 50s, early 60s, with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, and Marilyn Monroe would show up. Roselli, back to Roselli, he was sort of a go-between with Giancana and Kennedy, and they shared a girlfriend, Judith Exner. Roselli was real close to her, so all that was sort of mixed together, and it began to create this image of Las Vegas as this really sort of, especially once the Rat Pack began to draw attention to it, the movie Ocean's 11 in 1960, it just became to see it had a mystique to it. And that really began to draw a lot of attention to Las Vegas, including what the Stardust was. Then Frank Rosenthal. So when Alan Glick buys his Argent Corp, took over the Stardust, the Hacienda, the Marina, which, by the way, a small portion of the Marina has been incorporated into the MGM Grand, the green one out by the airport. The only one that's still fully operational from the Argent Corp days that Rosenthal had oversight of is the Fremont downtown, owned by Boyd Gaming now, a publicly traded company. But yeah, the Stardust, once Rosenthal came in, built this massive sports book, did a show from the Stardust sports book, had Frank Sinatra, I think Ali was on the show. I can't remember who all was on the show, but it was one of these talk show things that was on Saturday nights in Las Vegas. A lot of attention began to be focused on Las Vegas, largely through the Stardust, through Frank Rosenthal, bookmaker, odds maker from Chicago. Used to sit in Wrigley Field taking bets on game action during games, Cub games. Ran bookies out at horse tracks, and then Rosenthal goes to Miami, goes to Las Vegas, runs the Stardust. Spilatro comes in, and then you had all the whiz-bang stuff that happened. But the Stardust was right at the heart of that. In the movie Casino, as you know, they changed the name of the Stardust, but that was to the tangents. But that was the Stardust. That was the casino that the De Niro character, based on Rosenthal, was playing. In Nicholas Pileggi's book, by the way, Casino, all the names it's a nonfiction book, and so all the names are in there. It's Frank Rosenthal, it's Tony Spilatro. They had to change the name for the movie, though, for legal reasons, because everybody named would have needed some sort of residual, some sort of payment. So they tried to minimize they tried to minimize, the actual use of actual names for the movie. You had Chicago bosses portrayed under different names. You had Kansas City bosses portrayed under different names. But that was why. In the book, though, the real names are used.
Something that I think is really interesting about the Stardust is that one of the reasons that Flamingo initially failed is, in my opinion, that it was focused on the high roller. And it was difficult to get those people and the entertainers and everything that was required for that out to Las Vegas when it was young. And Accardo had an insight. He thought, wait a minute, what if we build a resort? We'll call it the Stardust. We'll name all the different areas, the wings, after the planets. We'll introduce penny slots, 50 cents, all-you-can-eat buffets. We can't just depend on the high roller, because the blue-collar guy's nickel spends just as good as the millionaire. And I think we see the effect of that in Las Vegas even today, especially downtown.
The high roller, the whale, is a handful of guys. They need those casinos full all the time. And that's your average guy who is going in, punching the clock, and cashing that check right before he walks into that casino. That's what keeps the casinos going on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think Accardo's Stardust was the beginning of that. What do you think about that, Larry?
I think that's absolutely 100% true. And even back in the in the Flamingo days, it took a PR person to say they were bringing in Jimmy Durante and all these Hollywood stars, and somebody said, "Let's get a buffet go." So even back then, and into what you're talking about with the Stardust, and they began, and Circus did that, by the way, with Jay Sarno. They began to try to appeal more to. They needed to get gamblers over there to spend money. I mean, keep in mind, back in those days. Thus the shows, the entertainers and all that, it was to draw gamblers there, because all those other things were a loss leader, like cheap buffets and cheap rooms and all that. It was because you wanted people on the casino floor. So mathematically, you're not going to win. So they wanted people on the casino floor gambling, because that's where the money was. Things have transitioned now. Now, arguably, Las Vegas, according to the Wall Street Journal, since 1999, taking the COVID years out, but since 1999, casinos in the Las Vegas Strip have made more money, not from gambling, made more money from conventions, from resort amenities like entertainment and food and all that. But yeah, back in those days, the Stardust was one of the first ones to bring a sense of fun, to get the average person in town to hit the craps tables, the 21 tables, the slot machines, the penny slots, as you're saying. And downtown was that way too. Benny Binion, I know he's not a Chicago, he's a Dallas guy, but Benny Binion downtown was doing the same thing. There's another story too, by the way, which we can get into later, which is why didn't Tony Spilotro and Frank Rosenthal and that group get into downtown? Part of that was Benny Binion blocked that, and that's another dramatic episode, as it was in the way Spilotro and some of those Chicago guys shook down a lot of the gamblers. One of them left. One of the most prominent sports bettors, a guy named Billy Walters, left because he was being shaken down by Spilotro until Spilotro was killed. Then he came back. So it was a violent time in Chicago. Not only was Chicago at the center of making it more of a egalitarian town where we want the average gambler to come in. Again, the cheap food, the cheap restaurant, and people still are nostalgic for that. A lot of the old timers get very upset that Las Vegas has transitioned to a more expensive town and as kind of a convention town. They remember the old, like you're talking about, the penny slots and the way Las Vegas used to be. But so Chicago ushered in a lot of that common person appeal at casinos, but also a real violent era, especially during the 70s. Keep in mind, Frank Rosenthal's car was blown up in 82. So it was going into Herbert Blitzstein was killed, I think, in 96. I think it was 97. He was shot to death in 97. He was one of Tony Spilotro's primary enforcers from Chicago. Herbert, they called him Fat Herbie Blitzstein. So it really went into the 90s. This lasted a long time.
Well, talk to us a little bit about the Black Book and exclusion of like Marshall Cafano and Sam Giancana from the casinos. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, that was, so it's really funny because up at Lake Tahoe, as you guys know the geography of Nevada, Southern Nevada, Clark County, where Las Vegas is, and way up north, really sort of by Reno is Lake Tahoe. Frank Sinatra had a piece of a place up at North Lake Tahoe called the Cal Neva. Sam Giancana was a hidden owner, big playground for the Phyllis McGuire was dating Sam Giancana. He was seen on that property. So in that era, the regulators in Nevada, Governor Grant Sawyer was the governor at the time. They wanted a way to ban unsavory, undesirable characters from casinos. So they created this list of people excluded from Nevada casinos. Not just because of the Cal Neva, not just because of Sinatra and Giancana, but that era, they were trying to keep people out who were bringing a bad name to Nevada. And that's where the Black Book, the Mob Museum in Las Vegas has a copy of the original Black Book, which does have those people you named. And that's where that came about. It was a way to say, and it got challenged, by the way. Oscar Goodman, who later became mayor, and others said it's Tony Spilotro was put in it. The Savellas from Kansas City. Somebody was just put in it not long ago, a year or two ago. It wasn't a mob person. It was somebody involved in some sexual allegations and things. So it's still an active document. But yeah, it was a way to keep, quote, undesirable characters out of Nevada casinos. The reputation of Nevada back in those days was those people were hurt. Civic people, Chamber of Commerce people, the sort of people trying to build Nevada up were embarrassed by all these mobsters. They thought it brought a bad name to the state. Again, it wasn't like it is now, where the Mob Museum, which opened in 2012, great place, the whole history of the mob. I do a monthly column for the Mob Museum. There's enormous interest in all those casinos we're talking about, the Stardust, the Sands, the Dunes, which are all gone. There's just enormous interest in those things now, and the mobsters like those from Chicago. And you guys see this with the interest in the Chicago outfit. There's just enormous interest now in that world, which in those days was seen as sort of a, not something the chamber wanted to brag about.
It's a little interesting, too, the irony of how, the state and the Gaming Commission is okay with organized crimes, ideas, and monies to come in and build, which they knew it was, and run and make them profitable and take that tax dollars. But we don't want you walking in those front doors once it's done.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Well, but they, Mo Dalitz had the DI, the Desert Inn. And so, yeah, back then it's really funny because like Bob Miller, who became governor, his son was Secretary of State on the Clark County Commission. So that next generation, they were not anyway associated with organized crime. But even back then, people in Nevada didn't think it was that big of a deal that the people like Mo Dalitz were honored. And it was not, yeah, you're absolutely right. It was, they welcomed the money to get the casino. And all those places were started with underworld money. Most of them, the big places on the Strip in Las Vegas and some of the places up in Reno. Yeah, come on in. We want your money. We want you to get you started. But when we're trying to clean it up in the 60s, and a lot of that started too, by the way, and I know I'm jumping all over the place, but a lot of that started too with the legislature authorizing corporate ownership of casinos, which eliminated the need to do background checks on every owner.
Sure.
Before, as you guys know, when you own stock in Walmart, McDonald's, whatever, when you're a shareholder, there are limitless numbers of shareholders in a corporation, in a publicly traded company. You can't check the background of every single person who has shares. Before that corporate ownership was allowed, background checks had to be done, which is why Rosenthal, by the way, struggled to get. He ran those casinos for Argent Corp, but wasn't licensed to run casinos because background. Yeah, I mean, you remember the famous blow up that Rosenthal had with Harry Reid. Yelled and screamed at a regulatory meeting because individuals had to be background checked.
Thank you very much to our guest, and join us next time for episode 4, where we continue our discussion of the Chicago outfit in Las Vegas.